people in doctor's office, they say that, Hasidic people come there and they literally don't understand what's being said to them. Now, I know in the medical profession, even, educated people may not understand, but they're talking about real basic stuff that there's a disconnect. They simply don't speak the language enough to understand what's going on with them, what's going on with their loved ones.
Welcome to Wrong Speak, the podcast about the things we believe to be true, but cannot say. I'm Jonathan Kay. In this episode, I'll be talking to Naftuli Moster, a New York-based social activist and the founder of a group called Young Advocates for Fair Education, or YAFED. It's an advocacy organization aimed at reforming private New York schools run by ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews, often called yeshivas. Many of these yeshivas, Moster argues, provide Hasidic children with a narrow education centered on Jewish ritual, but without the basic language and numeracy tools required to get a job or even function properly in a wider Western society. And Moster should know because he is a product of these schools, having been raised in this ultra-Orthodox New York Jewish community. And while many of our Wrong Speak guests face a political price for their advocacy on social media and within their professional circles, Moster's situation is more personal. Members of his own family and circle of friends have chastised him or even shunned him because of what they see as an act of betrayal. Recently, I spoke with Moster over the phone. Mr. Moster, could you tell us a little bit about your own experience with education? Did you go to a yeshiva in New York?
Yes, I attended a Hasidic yeshiva my entire life, from when I was about 2 years old or 2.5 years old till I was 20. To answer your question about my experience, basically I received a similar education to what all Hasidic boys receive, 0 minutes, no secular education at all in high school. So in elementary and middle school, the secular education took place at the end of the day from approximately 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. And it included just basic English and arithmetic. And the quality of the secular education was also pretty poor. So in addition to, receiving just 2 subjects out of probably about 12 or 14 that's required, the quality was really poor. So both students and the administration or the adults in the room didn't really take secular education as nearly as seriously as they did the Jewish studies. So, for instance, kids would always say, "Oh, why do I need to know secular studies? Well, why do I need to know?" And there's the sense that, we live in such an insular community. Everyone around us speaks Yiddish. So why is it important, And the adults didn't make a convincing case at all for why we would need it in the end. The reality is, of course, that ultimately all Hasidic men do need to have a basic education just so they can go out there and earn a living. But so this was the elementary and middle school. And then in high school, from approximately the age 13, we would spend about 12 or 14 hours a day in yeshiva, but we'd study exclusively Judaic studies. So we would learn the Torah, Talmud, Halacha, which is Jewish law, and some Hasidic philosophy. All of it we'd learn, and it would be taught in Yiddish. Some of it has text that is in Hebrew or Aramaic, but it would all be translated into Yiddish, which was our spoken language. And this is the language we spoke at home, in the streets, in the synagogue, and in the yeshiva. In fact, in elementary and middle school, where we did have the 90 minutes of secular education, generally speaking, that too would be done in Yiddish, because otherwise the kids would literally not understand what's being taught.
Are you a fluent Yiddish speaker as a result of this?
Yes. I would say over the past few years when my spoken language has shifted to pretty much English, some of my Yiddish is a little bit rustic, I would say. But yeah, I definitely spoke fluent Yiddish as a child and as an adolescent, and still do.
Yiddish is an obsolete language in many parts of the Jewish community itself. You referenced a community. How would you define that word community in terms of you growing up?
Well, the Hasidic community in New York State is really big and flourishing. They have major kind of centers, if you will, in New York City. You have Brooklyn, some in Queens. Within Brooklyn, you have Borough Park, which is very Hasidic, Williamsburg, which is very Hasidic, Crown Heights, which is split between Jewish Hasidic community and the Black community. But those are major Jewish or Hasidic communities. And then you have in Rockland County, you have Muncie, New Square, Kaiser, and then in Orange County, which is further up north, you have Kiryas Joel, which again is 100% Hasidic. So, but overall, generally speaking, we often refer to the Hasidic community as one because generally speaking, they share most of the same characteristics, even though, within it you have certain sects which belong, they kind of follow a different rabbi or charismatic leader, but ultimately, with everything else, it's pretty much almost identical.
Was this in New York City you were going to school?
I went to school in New York City, yes, but the same exact issues going on in all parts of the states where there are Hasidic communities. In fact, it's not even limited to New York State. There's a flourishing ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic community in New Jersey. And then there are other Hasidic communities popping up in different states. And they kind of essentially bring along the same education system wherever they go.
How did you come to speak what I hear is fluent English? Is that something you had to teach yourself outside of school?
Well, first of all, the short answer is yes. But I should add that, we did grow up in New York. We did get those 90 minutes. Additionally, in my family, my parents spoke English. My mother comes from a more English-speaking background. So she grew up more modern Hasidic. And back in the day, this was kind of more common than you have it now. But also my father, again, back in the day, even very Hasidic people, back then they didn't have all the infrastructure. And by that, I'm mostly referring to the yeshivas that they have now. So there would be much more interaction with people who aren't Hasidic or even ultra-Orthodox or even Jewish. So both they would feel the need to learn more secular studies, but also they would pick it up more naturally as well, just by communicating, by interacting. That doesn't exist anymore. Nowadays, Hasidic boys grow up so insular and so secluded in the Hasidic community that they really have no exposure to anyone on the outside. And this has kind of like two effects. One is that they don't pick up the English language, or any other kind of like basic knowledge that most, Americans kind of take for granted because they pick it up along the way. But it also means that they don't get to interact with the diverse people that exist in New York and in other states, really.
But if I understand you correctly, it sounds like the growth and the flourishing of the Hasidic community in New York City and New York State has paradoxically made it more insular because it's now big enough that it has the infrastructure it needs to not depend on other groups. Is that the case?
That's absolutely the case. In fact, I would give you some more specific examples. Growing up, a car service, which is basically like a taxi, in Borough Park would pretty much consist of non-Jewish or secular Jewish Russians or other, ethnicities and cultures. Now you often find even the car services are Hasidic. So even some areas where there used to be non-Hasidic people, the little interaction we'd have, that also no longer exists. So, again, there are still some professions that, Hasidic people don't take on, but even that often has a negative consequence because, for instance, who is the only non-Hasidic person in a Hasidic yeshiva? Generally speaking, that would be the janitor. So it actually has this effect of making it seem to kids, that others who are not Hasidic or not Jewish are less than us. You know what I mean? And I'm afraid that this carries on, they carry this along with them as they leave yeshiva, and they have the sense that, we're better than everyone. And look, the thing is, it's also reinforcing the Torah, that we're the chosen people and, all these stories that go along with it. And then kind of like you see it playing out in action. So it could make kids feel like, we're better than them and, that we could, treat them, let's just say, a little bit less wonderful as we treat, other Hasidic people.
There's a stereotype of Jewish educational culture as being highly aspirational, where every kid is supposed to become a doctor or a lawyer or whatnot. When you went to school, what did you imagine your career would look like? Did you take the SAT? Did you imagine you go to law school? Was there a guidance counselor who talked to you about what you'd be doing after you graduated? Like, was college something you thought about when you were at yeshiva?
No, not at all. In fact, you mentioned SATs. We didn't know what SATs were. We didn't even know what a GED would mean. That's like the equivalent of a high school. In fact, nor did I probably know what a high school is at the time. There was no preparation at all for this. And in these Hasidic yeshivas, every single child is destined and groomed to be a rabbi, or what they call a Talmud Chacham, which means a learned man, but by learned, it means exclusively in Judaic studies, kind of like with the aim of becoming a type of rabbi. So this is what they are prepping every single child for. So imagine, let's say there was a school where all the parents who send their kids over there have already decided that they want their kids to be accountants when they grow up. What do you think they focus almost the entire day teaching these kids? From a very young age, they probably begin teaching them math, right? And other kind of accounting-related courses. Why not? I mean, if they've already made the decision that this is what they're going to grow up, why not begin teaching them at a very young age? So this is essentially what's happening here. If the assumption is that every single parent who sends their kid to these yeshivas wants their kid to grow up to be a rabbi, then that's what these yeshivas are essentially preparing them for. Now, I think that's misguided, because the reality is that 95% of them don't grow up to be a rabbi, and they do end up having to join the workforce, but they're now essentially handicapped for life from doing so properly. So there's a lack of foresight in these yeshivas. But it's funny that you mentioned the educated culture, or essentially stereotype about the Jewish people, because ironically, as this debate is kind of like intensifying, you often hear Hasidic people pointing to, some Nobel Prize winners are saying, look, this one was Jewish, that one was Jewish, or this big lawyer is Jewish, and that big lawyer is Jewish, as though those people studied in the Hasidic yeshiva. And it's just the irony, because those people, they didn't attend a Hasidic yeshiva. They actually received a very good secular education from when they were very young. So if anything, it makes the opposite case. But yes, in our community, education is understood very differently than in the other, kind of Jewish communities, where, secular education is highly valued and people want to, become doctors and lawyers and finance people. In our communities, education is limited to just becoming a big Talmud Chacham, which means being very well learned in Talmudic studies.
Just to step back a little bit, because I think there are distinctions within the Jewish community that maybe many Jews themselves are unsure about. When you talk about the Hasidim, that's distinct from sort of mainline Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jews who might combine a very observant and spiritual life with normal assimilation into the workforce. Yes, Hasidim are distinguished. Right. I think most people know them as being distinguished by dress, but there's also a theological component too. Could you briefly describe how you imagined yourself when you were a student? How you imagined your community to be distinct from other Jewish groups?
First of all, I would like to respond to the main point that you're making, because that actually deserves to be elaborated on. So yes, because otherwise people can conflate the two. In fact, they would essentially do what you did earlier, which is point to the highly educated Jews and say, hey, this must be a smear campaign against yeshivas, because look, I know this Jewish man who's very educated, that Jewish man who's very educated. So what are these critics talking about, right? And this is often what we get. We have always been crystal clear where the problem is. So let me give you just a little bit a description of the kind of like the Jewish spectrum. So you have all the way at the very left, you have secular Jews, right? They're just culturally Jewish. They maybe observe a few holidays, once in a blue moon, maybe attend, synagogue, but maybe not even then. And then you have kind of like to the right of that, you have the Reform Jews, conservative Jews, and conservative doesn't mean politically, it means conservative compared to the Reform. And then you have, the Orthodox spectrum. So first you have modern Orthodox Jews. Those are the Jews that you've described, which is basically they believe that you could be an Orthodox Jew while also integrating somewhat into, society, into, in this case, the American culture. So that's the modern Orthodox. Then you have, to the right of that, you have, let's say, the broad umbrella of ultra-Orthodox Jews. That is broken out into two main categories or main groups. One is the Litvish community, Litvish, oftentimes also referred to as yeshivish or as black hat, I guess because they wear black hats. But basically, they are also they're ultra-Orthodox, as I said, under that umbrella, but they tend to also value education more, pursue higher professions, and so forth. To the right of that, within the ultra-Orthodox spectrum, you have the Hasidic community. It originated as more of a kind of like an offshoot of ultra-Orthodoxy, hundreds of years ago, where they believed that, not every single person needs to be learned, and you could kind of like be included in the community if you participate in the community. They value dancing and singing and telling stories and following a charismatic leader, as I mentioned before, a rabbi. So it started off kind of like almost as a lighter movement, but then it became stricter and stricter over time. And in that community is where the main problem exists. And within there, it mostly exists among Hasidic boys. The girls do tend to get a better education. And as I've explained earlier, the main reason the boys don't receive a great secular education is because they are all destined and groomed to be rabbis. In Orthodox Judaism, women can't become rabbis. Therefore, you need someone else to, they are essentially the best people to provide for the family, so to speak. I mean, that sounds terrible the way I put it. I'm just explaining what is the view of the yeshiva leaders, where they believe that the men are all destined to be rabbis and the women can't become rabbis. Therefore, the women can be prepared to earn a living for the family, especially during the first few years of marriage when the husband is definitely still sitting and learning Talmud and Torah and so forth, in what is essentially described as a rabbinical college.
Did you find the study of the Talmud and the Torah to be intellectually stimulating? Because I know there are people who find it fascinating. I confess that from my own Jewish education, it did get a little tedious after a while. Were there people in your yeshiva who really got into that in a serious intellectual way? And how did you figure in that process? Was it interesting to you?
Yes, I think it is intellectually stimulating. And I think a lot of people derive a lot of benefit and kind of fulfillment and satisfaction from it. The question is, does that translate into anything in the real world? And I think to some extent, yes, of course, it helps you extrapolate things and stuff, but it doesn't help substitute English, math, science, and social studies. That it doesn't, do that. And I want to point out that you could take anything. I often use this example. Let's say if parents chose to keep their child home and have the child sit and play video games all day long. Do you not think that this child would eventually become some sort of whiz in video game playing and even developing video games and stuff like that? I think they would. So the point is really you could take anything, and if you spend that kind of time and energy on, understanding it, then yes, the children will be very good at that. And there might be a little bit of spillover to other areas where they would be good at. But again, it won't take the place of learning basic English, math, science, social studies, and so forth. The reality is, and this is common knowledge, you can come and see it for yourself, nearly all Hasidic grown men are unable to speak efficiently or effectively in the English language. They have a hard time stringing together sentences. Spelling is atrocious, or understanding often. I often hear stories where doctors or people in doctors' office, they say that, Hasidic people come there and they literally don't understand what's being said to them. Now, I know in the medical profession, even, educated people may not understand, but they're talking about real basic stuff that there's a disconnect. They simply don't speak the language enough to understand what's going on with them, what's going on with their loved ones. And this is something that happens everywhere, in every area of their lives. So that's my point. Yes, Talmud is definitely stimulating, study, but it doesn't substitute the basic subjects that are needed.
How old are you?
I'm 32 at the moment.
So you came of age, I guess in high school, you already had access to digital technology. Maybe not.
No.
But computers, no? Did you use computers in school?
No, we didn't use computers. Again, we didn't learn English. We didn't learn math. We didn't touch computers. Computers are actually, forbidden on a whole new level, right? There's a decree against any technology, let alone internet. There are scandals actually where yeshivas do get funding to install, computers and internet, and they end up really misusing it. So they'll get millions of dollars for this stuff, but really end up pocketing the money or using it for other things. So, but no, we didn't touch computers, just like we didn't learn basic English or math or science and so forth. I guess, it's important to stress this because even here, deep into our interview, you were still under the impression that we had access to computers. And I think, I'm not saying this in a way like, oh, you're not understanding, but the point is that for most people outside of the Hasidic community or inside the Hasidic community, they cannot comprehend the level of educational neglect we're describing. This isn't just schools that are underperforming. This is schools that are not teaching the basic subjects. Kids have never heard about college. They don't know anything that it entails. When I got out of the yeshiva and I actually walked into a college, I wanted to pursue a degree in psychology. It was by sheer luck that I even knew what a psychologist means, okay? And I walked into the school and they asked me, do you have a high school diploma? I had no idea what they're talking to me. I figured I never even attended high school because we call it yeshiva katana. I didn't know what a high school diploma is. I didn't know any of that. And then they asked me, they wanted to give me an entrance exam, which would basically, there's a program where you could get into college, without a high school diploma, but you have to take certain credits up front, certain courses up front. And when you finish them, you have 24 credits towards your degree as well as your high school diploma. So, but even to get into that kind of program, you still need to pass a basic entrance exam, which consists, at the time at least, of just basic English, an essay, that consists of an essay and an easy math exam. But even those I didn't know how to pass. I didn't know what the word essay meant, let alone how to actually construct one. I couldn't do basic math. We're talking about arithmetic. So this is what we're really describing. We're not talking about just a school that's underperforming. Kids are not performing as well as we'd like on the standardized exams or stuff like that. No, we're talking about courses, basic subjects just not being taught. There's a world on its own, and kids are just roaming around. I mean, they're learning, they're in schools. In fact, they have a high rate of attendance and a very low rate of dropout, because that too is not an option. It's a very, very insular community with tight controls. But unfortunately, that also means no secular education, certainly not in high school. Zero secular education. Boys are immersed 12 to 14 hours a day in yeshiva. On Saturdays, they're in the synagogue. So it's essentially just a full immersion without any exposure to the secular world or to secular studies.
I don't know if you feel comfortable telling me the name of the school you went to, but either way, could you tell me what the people you went to school with, what they're doing in life now, what sort of jobs they have?
Sure. I have no problem telling you which yeshiva I attended. I attended Bell's Yeshiva in Borough Park. Bell's, if you think of the spectrum within the Hasidic community, Bell's is probably somewhere in the middle. But again, there's not much variation within the
And
Hasidic community.
this is Brooklyn, yes?
This is in Borough Park of Brooklyn, yes. What do they do? I think some of them are still learning. Some of them are out there struggling. Look, for the first 4+ years that I was, essentially an adult, I worked in a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey. And I was just schlepping boxes all day long. Luckily, in evenings and weekends, I was going to college still to pursue my degree. But that was a major, essentially dissonance, if you will. While I'm carrying my boxes, doing the most mindless job, And in my head, I'm resenting that, I could be a doctor. I'm of age that if I had been prepped properly and I have the drive, I have the motivation, and I am a smart person, why am I schlepping boxes? You know what I mean? So it's a very frustrating experience, especially for those that are gifted, that could become, something bigger in their lives. But yeah, I think many of them work in warehouses and stuff like that. Now, some dabble in real estate and some end up becoming successful. Some do open their businesses. There's this flip side to it, is that because people feel so unprepared, they end up diving in, taking risk and diving into starting a business or stuff like that, or investing in real estate, which, it's a big risk because you could lose everything, overnight, or you could make a lot of money. In a community where there's not much choice and you have to provide for a growing family, I think people are more inclined to take the risk, especially when there is a safety net, so to speak. In this community, they work hard to make sure no one really starves, that no one is on the streets homeless. So that's kind of like the trade-off, if you will. I mean, I don't think it should be a trade-off. I think the community should be able to provide a solid secular education and still look after its, members. But that is, the other side of the coin, which is that the community does look after its people, those who adhere and follow the rules, so to speak. So people could take risks, and if they fail, someone will come and bail them out ultimately, or at least support them through the process until they get on their feet. So, like I said, it's a real mix. Some work in retail. There's a big photo store in New York City called B&H. It's owned by a Hasidic man, and he employs a lot of Hasidim. They have buses coming in from Brooklyn, or maybe from Brooklyn they take trains, I don't know, but they have buses going in from Rockland County, and I think even from Kiryas Joel on a daily basis. They even pray. They have a whole minyan, which is like, you need 10 people to pray every morning on the bus and so forth. So, those kinds of jobs that people end up, going to.
What did your parents think about, well, A, working in a warehouse in Newark, and B, doing your college degree at night?
When I started college, I was not working in a warehouse during the day. I was actually tutoring boys in a Hasidic yeshiva, in the same yeshiva that I had attended when I was a child or an adolescent. They were very dissatisfied with my going to college, mainly for the reason of, that it could ruin your prospects of a shidduch. Basically, everything is done in matchmaking. So there's it's not exactly matchmaking where, like forced marriage, to some extent maybe, but it's not exactly like that. So basically, there's a matchmaker who calls both parents, and they essentially compare notes. Okay, so you're this type of family, she's that type of family, and you're looking for this, they're looking for that. And then, then the couple gets to meet like once, twice, or top 3 times, and then they get engaged.
I'm guessing the matchmaker hasn't called your number recently. Is that right?
I'm happily married to my wife, so obviously we don't need a matchmaker. But the point is that back then it was a major concern that it would ruin the prospects of a good shidduch, so to speak, and not just for myself, but even for my family. And this is the main reason they didn't want me to attend college. But these things are obviously tough for people around you who believe that you're making the wrong choice, doing the terrible thing. And they could love you. They could genuinely love you and still think that going to college is what's going to ruin your life. But obviously, each person has to ultimately decide for themselves.
Tell me about the organization that you work for and the activism you do in the field of education.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So this actually came out of my own experience. So after being in college for several years, remember I was doing this part-time because I was working full-time during the day. At that point, I was, working in the warehouse. And I was, moving along, and I was doing well in college because I would dedicate literally my entire weekends and evenings after I came home from the warehouse work. And I would really put in everything I got and read and reread and reread the chapters, 4 times and taking notes each time again and again. And I was doing pretty well in school. But I had also delayed taking some of the harder courses till the end, such as, advanced math and hard science that I had to take. I'm saying as opposed to kind of like psychology, which I was taking earlier on. But so I finally, in I think what was essentially my senior year, I was taking Intro to Biology. We're talking Bio 101. And it was at that point I was in a school where it wasn't an Ivy League college, so to speak. It was just a regular CUNY. CUNY stands for City University of New York, and they have basically branches across the city. The one I attended was on Staten Island, and we were doing Intro to Biology, and for the rest of the class, it was all stuff that they had heard before. Some of them probably weren't that great in elementary and middle school and perhaps even in, college. But the point is, for them, none of this was brand new. And for me, literally everything was new. It was the first time learning about molecule and cells and biodiversity and photosynthesis. And it stood out to me that even after all these years in college, yes, I'll, have a better grasp on the English language. Yes, I'll know a little bit more, stuff that Americans know just by communicating and interacting with people and doing a lot of searches on the internet when I'm embarrassed to ask. But when it comes to knowing the basics, like, Intro to Biology, I was just so far behind. And it occurred to me that what had been done to me in yeshiva was essentially a form of neglect. And I said to myself, why is it that parents are not allowed to neglect their children in terms of, depriving them of food, hitting them excessively, or depriving them of shelter, clothing? Why is it that when it comes to education that they're allowed to? So I began doing some research, and lo and behold, I discovered that in fact, no, parents are not allowed to neglect their children educationally either. In fact, I slowly discovered the laws that are in place, and I was shocked that New York State law had in place this law for many decades, requiring non-public schools to provide an education that is at least substantially equivalent to public schools, which means the law went on to explain, okay, so what do public schools need to teach? And they listed 12 branches of study: English, math, science, social studies, civics, and a bunch of them. And then there were New York State guidelines, which kind of like, interpreted or explained the law. And they listed these subjects by grade. So they said they had a Q&A section. What must non-public schools teach? And the answer was, okay, grades 1 to 6, the following. And they list like 10 subjects. 7 and 8, the following. High school, the following. And I was surprised that with all of this explicitly laid out there in the guidelines, we received either a fraction of it or none at all in the case of high school. So, I began kind of like looking into it, and I spoke to a civil rights attorney and organized some people to come together to tell their story to the civil rights attorney. And it was actually him, who suggested you should start an organization so that we can better coordinate the efforts. And that's what I did. That specific civil rights attorney ended up moving on, but different people came on board. So essentially that's how it all started. At this point, it's, the organization is more than just kind of like considering doing a lawsuit. It's also about raising awareness and doing advocacy more generally, and organizing the community to speak up and demand changes.
How do your family members and friends within the Hasidic community regard you now? Have you been able to retain your friendships and relationships with loved ones?
For the most part, I haven't maintained, contact with a lot of people, especially my friends from yeshiva. I mean, I'm kind of in a different environment. Remember, I went through college. I went through my bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in social work. And I've basically lived more in the secular world. So obviously, I don't have much contact with most of my friends from yeshiva. As far as family, yes, it's definitely a strained relationship. The family is not only, many of them oppose what I'm doing, and I don't think all of them oppose it, but I think even those that don't oppose it, it hurts them in a way, because in such an insular community, everyone knows that, oh, it's this person's sibling that's doing this. You know what I mean? It's a very, very tight-knit community. Everyone knows everyone. And, my siblings and my parents, they feel like they're walking on the street and, people are whispering behind their back, oh, this is the guy. You know what I mean? So this is the cost of living in such an insular community, and it could affect them in even more profound ways. For instance, if anyone, gives them even a slightly hard time getting their kid into the yeshiva, because they can choose not to accept children in these yeshivas. These are not public schools. And that's one of the biggest fears anyone in the community can have, because that basically uproots everything. It means the child doesn't have, the same kind of circle of friends that everyone in the community has. You don't feel like your place is in the community. That the women in the family don't feel part of it. So it's a major problem the way, this community unfortunately doles out punishment, sometimes not explicitly, but implicitly and in subtle ways. So it does kind of harm family members. And I obviously, empathize with them. The question then is, okay, so what can you do? Is the problem in the work that I do, or is the problem in the way the system works? Unfortunately, it's not an easy solution.
In some of the journalistic coverage I've read about the Hasidic community in New York State, I've come across allegations that suggest leaders of the Hasidic community are well connected in regard to New York State government and municipal governments, and that it's that connection that allows some of the yeshivas to skirt the standards that otherwise govern private education. Do you think that's true?
Yes, it's absolutely true. And you're right, the media here often talks about the block vote.
So the block vote?
The block vote, BLOC. It basically means that the community votes as a
Hasidic
block.
community.
And exactly. And oftentimes, more broadly, the ultra-Orthodox community, they see themselves as sharing similar interests. So, and because this isn't, where people think for themselves, when it comes to politics, it's usually like the rabbi endorses a certain candidate, or several rabbis endorse a certain candidate, and then kind of like these mediators between the rabbi and the constituents and the members, they kind of get the message out, and that's essentially what the community votes for and who the community votes for. So it's a very powerful block vote, because, it just adds another, who knows what, like 50,000 votes, at least statewide or more, to a candidate, and it could really tip the scale. So they do wield a lot of influence. They also happen to have just a lot of connections. You see, when you have a sophisticated machine, like, for instance, there's a group called Agudath Israel. They happen to be on the Litvish side of the ultra-Orthodox spectrum, but they also cover the Hasidic, the entire ultra-Orthodox spectrum. They have a very powerful machine, lobbyist machine, essentially. They have events where all the legislators show up, and they, come in, and they essentially want to be in good graces of the Agudath Israel and the broader Orthodox Jewish community. So there's a lot of political influence. They end up having a lot of deep ties to various government officials. And this, of course, has prevented the city and state from making progress on this front. For instance, often, it's being reported about Mayor de Blasio, a major progressive, and, values education a lot. But on this issue, he was basically dragging his feet for more than 3 years after launching a so-called investigation into our allegations. And everyone could see through it. It's just purely because of the deep connections and essentially, like I said, the block vote that was basically preventing him from doing the right thing.
So let me take you back 3 years. Was this an investigation that you helped to spark?
I would say so. So basically, on July 27th of 2015, we submitted a complaint to the New York City Department of Education. And this complaint was signed by 52 yeshiva graduates and parents of current students at the time. And we named 39 yeshivas that we believed were not complying with the state law. And this wasn't the first letter that we sent, but this was the first letter in which we went into this kind of detail, having both signatories and naming specific institutions. And this basically made it so that the city could no longer ignore it, right? They had to say they're launching an investigation. But I think they were hoping that saying they're launching an investigation would be enough to kind of get us off their back. In reality, it only meant that now we had something to look forward to a report, to the outcome of the investigation, to the implementation of changes in these yeshivas once the findings come out. And so we stayed on this for all these years. And for 3 years, the city was basically just going on and on saying, yes, we're still making progress. Yes, we're still investigating. Oh, yes, we're taking it very seriously. But that was it. And everyone could see right through it, that it's just a political thing for them. In fact, occasionally, it would even leak out from the ultra-Orthodox community, from these Hasidic leaders, that it's intentionally being stonewalled even by the government. So there's the Satmar rabbi from Kiryas Joel. He often speaks kind of loosely and doesn't realize that, there are consequences and that people are listening. So he said very openly that the government was basically trying to turn a blind eye to this issue, but they were just being pressured by, they would say all kinds of terrible names to us, but basically they were being pressured by us to take it seriously. So finally, after more than 3 years, the city had no choice, and they released a report basically saying that, okay, they've managed to visit some of the 39 yeshivas, but the others simply didn't even let them in. In the ones that they did visit, they found that they're making some progress, some improvements, but by no means were they meeting the state requirements. So this was a major boost to our efforts, which it basically highlighted that all the allegations we've been making all along was true.
For the sake of listeners who are interested in learning more, what terms should they Google to read this report?
The best place really to learn about anything related to this matter is to find us on Facebook. We're Yafet.org, and on our Facebook page there are all these different updates, including links to that report. And there was a follow-up report, which basically reaffirmed the first report. And since then, there's been new developments. More recently, the state finally released guidelines. This is a whole story for itself. You see, there's the New York City kind of track, and then there's the New York State track. I mean, obviously they are related, but not very strongly. So New York State is the one who had a law, and there were the guidelines that I mentioned before. The guidelines were pretty clear all along, but there was one issue. The state delegated the responsibility to enforce the law to the districts. So they spelled out the guidelines, but then they said, okay, now you, the district, that's a smaller, kind of area, geographic area, you need to enforce this law. Each school district. New York City is its own school district. It's the largest in the state, of course. So they had to enforce it. But the problem is they didn't go into detail as to how they're supposed to enforce it. So several local districts use that lack of understanding how to enforce it as an excuse not to enforce it at all. And so the state went ahead and revised those guidelines, and they took a few years to do so. During this process, the ultra-Orthodox community used their political muscle to change the law that these guidelines were based on. So suddenly, as the state was ready to roll out the new guidelines, the law changed from underneath them. So they had to revisit the guidelines. So this happened in March and in April of this year, when the New York State has to pass the budget for the coming year. So the state went back and revisited their guidelines, and they finally released it just last month on November 20th. And there's basically been a nonstop, I don't know how to describe it, but basically it's been very, very hectic ever since, because, the guidelines were pretty strong and requiring a lot from the yeshivas for the first time in decades. And the yeshivas are furious about it, and they're mounting a ferocious attack. For now, it's mostly PR, but they're talking very publicly about bringing legal action. They're talking about even trying to change the law once again to make it impossible for the state to enforce these guidelines. So this is a very, very hot topic right now across New York State.
Just to be clear for our listeners, when you talk about the politicians and perhaps bureaucrats who allegedly are obstructionist, this isn't like a Jewish conspiracy, presumably, right? I'm guessing that many of these people who are in government and perhaps who are dragging their feet on education policy, they're doing it not because they're Jewish or they're religious, they're just doing it for their own crass political reasons. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I think most of them happen not to be Jewish. So, for instance, Mayor de Blasio is not Jewish. Governor Cuomo is not Jewish. commissioner of the state education department is not Jewish. The board of regents chancellor is not Jewish. So some of them have been dragging their feet, others haven't necessarily. But the point is, no, it's certainly not because they're Jewish. And if they were Jewish and, secular or Reformed Jewish, they probably would want to enforce these laws, because many Jewish people are actually the loudest proponents of enforcing secular standards in these yeshivas, because it's essentially an embarrassment for many people that the fastest growing Jewish population is so illiterate, essentially, at least in what we consider literacy, and are also now living in serious poverty and dependence on government assistance. So for many Jews, this is a major concern.
How closely does this parallel developments in Israel, where the so-called Haredim, I believe it translates to those who tremble before God, they also, analogous to what you just told me, they have very high birth rates, and for many years there's been a controversy about their drain on the welfare state. Is what is happening in New York State roughly analogous to what's happening in Israel?
Yes. Now, first, let me just say that Haredim, here we call them ultra-Orthodox Jews. So it basically covers the same kind of umbrella, if you will, although some people push back and they like to use other terms. But really, the most common term here is ultra-Orthodox Jews. It mirrors it very much, but I should point out that in Israel, it stands out more because it's a Jewish state, and the Hasidic and the ultra-Orthodox community in general makes up a much more significant portion of the state of Israel. So the concern is much more visible, and people, nearby, secular Jews or just non-ultra-Orthodox Jews, they really feel the burden of having to support such a large community that's refusing to, provide a proper education and be able to participate in the workforce. Here in New York, it's not felt in the same way for the most part, because of the insularity and because it is a secular state and it's so big. Most people didn't feel it or don't feel it in the same way. But of course, after years of bringing awareness to this, we've been steady in the media here. In recent months, we've gotten quite a bit of coverage in terms of editorials now taking a position on this. So it's brought a lot of attention to this issue. So at this point, I think, yes, most people in the state have woken up to this serious issue. And I think this is why the state felt emboldened to finally release those guidelines.
Since 9/11, there has been a big focus, some would say maybe a hysterical focus, on what Muslims are being taught in their schools in Western countries. I know that in the United States, there's been a lot of fear about so-called madrasas and whether Muslim students are being taught secular material and that sort of thing. Does it surprise you that there appears to be a double standard about that issue? It sounds like if Muslim schools were as religiously oriented as the yeshivas you describe, there would be an outcry, particularly on the right side of the media spectrum.
That's a good point. But I do want to point out that I don't agree that in America there's a big concern about madrasas. I don't really hear anyone talking about it. For the most part, from what I gather, the madrasas here in the U.S., and particularly in New York, they abide by the law, and they provide a proper secular education. They may have some religious studies as well, some which, I don't know, some people might find objectionable. I'm not familiar with what they teach during that time. Nothing, from what I understand, nothing comes close to what's happening in these yeshivas, because even religious schools, for instance, Catholic schools that I do know exist in larger numbers, and they do provide a religious education. They tend to just have like an hour or two of religious studies at the end of the day, and the whole rest of the day is mostly secular studies, and they teach a full range of secular content. With the Hasidic yeshivas, it's pretty much the opposite. You know what I mean? Where it's all day Jewish studies, and at the end of the day, just a little bit of secular studies, if at all. And I agree that there's a double standard, because even though I don't know if these madrasas exist and there's a major concern, but if they did exist, we all know how, people would feel about that. Or let's say, take, for example, how several, legislators. There are a handful of ultra-Orthodox legislators who have taken on the yeshiva's side of the issue. And the way they speak about this issue, it's essentially contrary to New York State law, contrary to U.S. values. And they would say things like, we turn to rabbis for guidance. Imagine if other religious elected officials said stuff like that, where instead of saying we should go by the law, we should go by the Constitution, we should go by the New York Constitution, instead they would say, oh, I'm going to turn to my, imam or priest or stuff like that. Most New Yorkers would feel very uncomfortable with that. But it's just, what I've noticed in general with the Hasidic community, again, because of the insularity, most of the things, fly under the radar. Like one major issue with this plays out is in the ultra-Orthodox newspapers. They are completely, how would I describe it? They're unmonitored. So most of the ultra-Orthodox newspapers are totally unmonitored by anyone outside the ultra-Orthodox community. In fact, many of these newspapers are in Yiddish. So really, who gets to read them? Only other Yiddish speakers. They could say anything in there. Things against Yahweh, things against elected officials, things against, the law.
Actually, if I could just interrupt, because what I have noted is that the one time people do pay attention to these newspapers is when they will crop out women from photos,
right. Yeah.
Because that's something you don't have to speak Yiddish to notice that Angela Merkel has been cropped out of a picture of world leaders.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's silly almost to only focus on these newspapers when something like that happens. It's like, honestly, that's the least of my concern. It's like, okay, they didn't want to have a picture of a woman. They don't have pictures of women anytime, even of other Jewish leaders. How do you expect them to make an exception for Angela Merkel or for Hillary Clinton? As you know, they've cut her out too. My point is that's nothing compared to the content, the words and the statements being made about anyone who's not like them, anyone who disagrees with them. There's never a quote, let's say they would never call me for a quote, on a legitimate, view of this issue, of this debate. Never. No, they would just, to the contrary, they would get quotes from those opposing us. They would call us the worst names, like lowlife and rotten people, and even worse, one newspaper referred to us as rodef, which means someone who's pursuing people to kill them. They use an analogy. They described a story as a metaphor or something of an adolescent running around with a knife in the presence of an infant. This is the kind of stuff that's happening in these newspapers all the time, and no one pays attention. And it's no surprise that occasionally we get not explicit death threats, but once in a blue moon, an explicit one. The one explicit death threat, we have to involve the police. So, yes, my point is that in general, these newspapers fly under the radar. In recent years, we've made an effort to bring the spotlight to these things. So just recently, for instance, the Satmar rabbi gave a speech in which he decried the new guidelines, and he said, he talked about how, look at our yeshivas, we produce these amazing, students and business people and all that stuff. And look at the public schools full of, drugs, crime, or criminals, drug addicts and stuff like that. This is stuff that most people don't know is being propagated in the Hasidic community, let alone by leaders who have thousands and thousands of followers. This leader, for instance, he essentially runs his own village. Isn't it something that, the public should be aware and follow, that there's certain things that is, very problematic that they're saying to all these thousands of followers. So this is changing now with us being around, and, since the issue touches on education, we bring the spotlight to these, to the content that is problematic.
Do you ever get messages from people within I guess it's perhaps now your old community, as you're not an active member anymore, saying, I wish I could support you, or I wish I could voice my support, but if I did, I'd lose my friends and my livelihood?
Every single day. I'm going to read something, a paper I have right in front of me, actually, because I just picked it up. A person sends me a check. He has to do MoneyGram, which is basically like, to anonymize that he sent money. He, she, I don't even know. And the letter goes as follows. To Naftuli Moster, I just got disgusted watching the despicable behavior and disgusting speech of our Rockland County legislature, he means legislator, Aaron Weeder. So we have a legislator here that's actually Hasidic, and he's one of the most ferocious opponents of Yafed. So he constantly speaks very negatively about us. So anyway, this person goes on, Aaron so far has offered zero change to improving our kids' secular education. Aaron has no plans for improvement. In close, please find a check of encouragement to your organization to keep up this urgent fight. Sincerely yours, anonymous Muncie resident. I should mention this whole letter is riddled with grammatical and spelling errors, but how can you blame these people? This is someone who went to this yeshiva. Their child is now attending this yeshiva and not receiving an education, and they're so frustrated. So they have to go quietly make a donation to us through this roundabout way to anonymize it, because otherwise, if someone finds out, they could be in deep trouble. But yes, this is something we get all the time, emails, Facebook messages, and stuff like that, people applauding us for basically doing the job that they can't do for themselves and for their own children.
Naftuli Moster, his organization is called YAFED, that's Young Advocates for Fair Education, YAFFED. You could find it on the web at yafed.org and on its Facebook page. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And good luck.
This has been a production of TNKR Media. Good talk.